Hi, everyone. I am Dr. Nicole Goodman from Brock University in Canada, and I will be presenting with my colleague, Dr. Aleksander Essex today. Thank you for having us at eVote ID 2020 COVID edition. We will be presenting today on secure online voting in a legislative context.
So what happened was back in March, the Canadian government instituted various lockdown procedures, the quarantine, and that affected not only sort of society broadly, but the functioning of Parliament itself. So Parliament was actually shut down, or at least limited to quorum, which was 20 members, physically distanced in the House out of a nominal 330 plus members. So naturally, as you can imagine, there were calls back in March to institute some kind of online solution because having 20 MPs in the House passing legislation just democratically is not a workable solution. From a physical distancing perspective, you can't have 330 people in the same room together. That's no good either. So online voting was seen as a possible way to address this. Now, of course, online voting has certain controversies surrounding its cybersecurity. So the research question that we wanted to ask is there a way to do online voting in the context of a legislative vote? And is there a way to do it safely? And what would that look like? We wanted to at least have some kind of concrete proposal that we could make for the government to consider. So the key argument here, the key differentiator between this context and online voting in general is very, very important. And that is that these legislative divisions are not a secret. Everyone can see that individual's voting record going all the way back through time. And that's a necessary part of the parliamentary democracy. So the fact that it is not a secret ballot means that we actually have a fighting chance to do it online in a safe way. But before we can get to that point, we do need to think through this a little bit. When we sat down and looked through all of these different options, the one that we arrived on and the one that we recommended to the Canadian House of Commons Parliamentary Committee on House Procedures was for members to vote in a video-based voting method, so like a Zoom-based method.
So in terms of definitions, in our paper, we use the terms remote online voting and remote electronic voting interchangeably. And specifically, we're looking at 4 subtypes of voting, which includes voting by email, voting by web, mobile application-based voting, and also voting by video teleconference. Now, email voting occurs whereby a member would receive their ballot via email and cast their ballot via email. Web-based involves casting a ballot online through a web browser like Safari or Chrome or Firefox. Mobile application voting involves downloading a mobile app to your an application to your mobile device and then casting your ballot. And video teleconference voting takes place via video, and this could be via a show of hands or a voice vote. So knowing that there wasn't sort of a robust literature examining remote online or remote electronic voting in the context of legislatures, one of the main works that we drew on coming from Canada is some work by David Docherty, where he draws on these 3 main functions, and he outlines functions of representation, scrutiny, and lawmaking. The function of representation implies that once elected, there's a general expectation that members are going to speak up for the voters who elect them. Then there's the notion of scrutiny. Now, scrutiny can pose some challenges. It implies holding government to account. So typical opportunities for scrutiny include items such as question period, debates on legislation, and other key items such as the budget, throne speech, committee work, caucus discussions. So enabling the scrutiny function in the context of remote online voting is a little bit trickier. And then finally, there is the lawmaking function, which entails being able to pass laws. And in many ways, actually having remote online voting better enables this lawmaking function, as we'll argue throughout the presentation, because it brings more fulsome voice to the table. So to be able to get a sense of what different legislatures were doing and how they were adapting to voting in the context of the pandemic, we carried out a survey of responses among legislatures, and we compiled quite a large list. However, for practical reasons, we could only represent so many cases in a tabular fashion. So we chose 6 cases that represent the 4 types of electronic voting, remote electronic voting, that we examine in the paper. And then, of course, a 5th possible option, which is making no technical amendments and having the in-person voting. So you can see here that Australia opted for the in-person option with some restrictions, of course. Canada initially was also opting for the in-person option with some restrictions, although they have since made the move to video voting and taken our recommendation. The UK moved to web-based voting. They were very lucky. They actually had infrastructure in place already called Member Hub that they were able to build upon. The EU went for email voting, probably the least secure, but they were one of actually the first groups or jurisdictions to make the move to a technical solution. Brazil, also like the UK, was able to build on the technology that they already were using within the legislature, and they opted for an application-based system. And then Belgium, for some of their committee votes, was opting for a video hybrid option.
So before we can move ahead with any online voting solution, we need to tackle the question of verifiability. And not just the ability to verify, but actually how it's done and actually whether it's done. So we need to have training and procedures and support to make this happen. We need training towards 3 verification goals. The first goal is that we should be able to detect when something goes wrong. When a member's vote is not recorded correctly, for whatever reason, could be error, it could be fraud. We need to be able to detect that, right? Now we have the ability to detect that. So now let's actually enshrine that in some kind of procedure and actually train people to check. The second goal is reporting. This is important because just because you can check, and just because you did check, and just because you actually identified perhaps that something went wrong, doesn't mean that you actually report it. And there's been previous research, I've done research and others that have shown that there sometimes are situations where people will discover that an error has occurred and they won't report it. And there's various reasons for this. It could be just a simple matter that they just aren't putting 2 and 2 together. They might have thought it was their own fault. They might not know how to do the reporting. So there's a number of factors there that could impede the likelihood that a discovered error would actually even be reported. And then finally, there needs to be some way to recover from the error. So if reporting did happen, if detection did happen, there needs to be some way that it can be sort of rolled back, or the vote can be retaken in some way that is agreed upon ahead of time. There are a few security aspects that we need to think about. The first is how are the members authenticated? Now, in many cases, the authentication is password-based. So when an entity casts a vote through one of these systems, whether it's email or web-based or app-based, what the system registers that not that the member voted, but anybody who has the password voted. And these aren't necessarily the same thing, especially when you consider that passwords are a transferable credential. So one of the things that we raised in the committee when we spoke to the parliamentary committee was the possibility that staffers might end up voting on behalf of members So that and the members of the committee agreed that this would be a problem if this happened, because members aren't supposed to be giving out their credentials to their staffers to, oh, I've got to go to this meeting. Maybe you can cast the vote on my behalf. Here's my password. But so in the in-person version of this, you can't do that, because you have to stand in the house. You have to stand up and be present in the house. Your entity is present in the house. But in a digital world, your entity is expressed through an identity, through a password, which is why we kind of lean towards more the video teleconference version, because you can see my face, you can hear my voice. And so that is a very immediate way to identify somebody. And it's also something that is not transferable, at least not without some cyber attack that might maybe some kind of deep fake. However, the committee concluded that the risk of deep fake threats is still fairly remote. It's a lower threat at this point. It's like a threat on the horizon, but not something that they were too concerned about at this moment. The other issue is about intent capture accuracy. So this is like a major issue in the United States with all of their voting equipment. And how do we know that the machine is correctly registering the intended the way that that you're meaning to vote. So when you have a web-based or an app-based question being put to you, typically there'll be one button to vote for, another button to vote against, or a button to abstain. And these are all very unambiguous. When you click the button, it captures that in an unambiguous fashion. When you have email, depending on how it's implemented, so if it's just somebody writing, yes, I vote for this, that could also potentially be ambiguous. And then, of course, in video voting, it's quite possible to be ambiguous if a member is not correctly hearing the question, or maybe they're gesturing at the wrong time. Similarly, in the paper, we talk about an instance at a city council meeting in a small town in Ontario where the councillor voted in favor of something, but the Zoom connection glitched slightly and it dropped the relevant consonant, and it created the appearance of them voting against it. So their vote was initially registered for the opposite, and it was only because the city staff was on the ball that they were able to recover from that. So when we look at the threat tree that we might draw from all of these possibilities, one thing that we don't really have to worry about, because the vote is not secret, is we don't have to worry about attackers trying to get information about who voted for whom, because it's public record. So the main threat that we're concentrating on is malicious efforts to modify the vote. Now, there are at least three ways that we thought of that this could be approached from an attack perspective. The first approach is that the attacker might try to modify the question as it's put to the member. So the member might think that they're voting for, the opposite of what they actually are voting for. And one way you could do that is to selectively edit the video feed of what they see. So you could take a question from earlier in the day and withhold it from them and then replay it later, and then do some kind of swapping. You could try to modify the image itself. You could just sort of like overlay some graphics where the question is being stated. If the question is being put via voice, it might be difficult to fake that, but it is certainly possible that that a deep fake of the Speaker of the House's voice could be created to ask a question that's somehow phrased opposite, to induce the member to vote in the opposite way. Similarly, the attacker could try to modify the response, again with a selective edit or a deep fake. So selective edit being, raising my hand in support of a motion from earlier in the day and then replaying it, or, just a deep fake of me saying, hi, I'm member so-and-so and I vote for this individual. And then finally, and this probably is the more likely mode of attack, is simply to prevent a member from voting, period, through availability denial. So this could be a network denial of service attack. And this, in Canada especially, this is potentially a very serious issue because as it turns out, Canada is actually a very big country. And also there's a lot of remote communities. And I mean really remote. I mean like so remote that if it is snowing, food doesn't fly in for that day. So there are regions of Canada where it's very weather dependent. And if they can't see the sky, they can't see the satellites, and they can't connect to the internet with a high degree of reliability. So if I was an attacker and I knew that, I might just, try to bring that member's video connection down to make it look like just some connection issue to prevent them from voting. And that is a problem that needs to be handled.
So having looked at the technical side of things, we need to question, what does putting in a remote online voting solution, what sort of implications does this have for the core legislative functions that we talked about earlier? So this includes scrutiny, lawmaking, and representation. Now, scrutiny seems to present the biggest challenge. It doesn't address items such as motion introduction or debate, and it raises questions as to how well scrutiny can actually be addressed when members are not face-to-face and they're not able to have those interactive kind of question period sittings, particularly the more interactive settings that we see in Westminster parliaments. Now, lawmaking and representation, by contrast, are perhaps better met by e-voting than they are in these pandemic circumstances where these limited requirements are being put on members and we're not allowed to have as many members, for example, in the legislature. So I can give you one example from Canada. On March 23rd, for example, at the beginning of the pandemic here, 32 of 338 members attended a session to pass emergency members. Similarly, a couple months later, on May 26, 51 members voted in quite a tight vote, 28 to 23, to pass a controversial motion that would suspend regular sittings until October. So having such few members making these important decisions is really, really problematic for, inclusiveness, representation, and participation. So obviously, this has implications for representation, and it has implications for lawmaking as well, because we're not seeing that fulsome legislative voice being represented at the table to be able to pass these laws. Beyond these legislative implications, there are implications sort of beyond this pandemic setting that made us think about what are some of the long-term possible implications or benefits for accessibility. So what are other situations that we may want to have some type of remote online voting system in place for our legislatures? There could be other crises, perhaps second waves of COVID as we're seeing right now, or third waves, extreme weather from climate change, other types of emergency situations that may prevent members from physically attending a legislature and voting and debating legislation. Also, in terms of accessibility, there could be unique situations where a remote online system may help individual members in special circumstances. These could be circumstances following the birth of a baby, nursing an infant, for example, a case where there's sort of a real hot button issue that's going on in a particular area, a particular constituency, where a member is really torn between being in the legislature to vote for crucial legislation or staying in the legislature to support his or her constituents. And remote options in those cases might better enable access for members. There are some jurisdictions that already have such measures in place. The UK House of Commons, for example, allows proxy voting for new parents, and Australia's House of Representatives allows proxy voting for members nursing infants. So allowing these types of accommodations is not unlike introducing other types of convenience reforms in public elections to make voting easier for groups of electors that face additional barriers when voting. So in conclusion, we argue that remote electronic voting is solvable for regular, non-anonymous votes in a legislative context for two reasons. One, as we stated at the beginning, these votes are a matter of public record. Also, legislatures have the technical wherewithal, we hope, and capacity and the broader resources to be able to provide support for such changes, the necessary support, training, etc. So our recommendation was that voting by video teleconference is the best model, the most workable solution for remote electronic voting for Canada's House of Commons in the short term, and an option that other jurisdictions should consider looking at. For several reasons. The technology, as Alex said, is less easy to spoof compared to changing an email, for example. Voice and face cannot be shared. Using video also interfaces more closely with the parliamentary tradition of standing during a vote. Now, this doesn't mean that we still don't require procedures. Procedures are critical. They are very important. So procedures still need to be developed, such as implementing a verification loop, coming up with a process for recounts. I mean, these are just two examples. Also, issues remain around the dimension of accountability and scrutiny, and how do we solve for that? That's something that further research should look at. And then a final point is that governments must really start to invest in this technology now, because there could be another situation in the near future where, that legislative voting is affected, and coming together with some kind of hodgepodge solution, might get us through in the short term. But now that we have these lessons, it's really important that government starts investments now for the long term if these become issues again.
Our message is to any of the parliamentarians or staff, either in Canada or anywhere, that are considering this move towards an online legislative voting solution, is that if you're going to do it, you have to do it right. There has to be a mechanism for verification, for detection, reporting, and recovery. And so I want to stress that point, because when we spoke about this to committee, they wrote a report and they kind of left all this stuff out. So, remember, if you're going to buy the puppy, you need to be committed to training it. So that's, I think, the message that we want to make. And we wish everyone good luck in their parliamentary democracies going forward.